Okay, it began with my cousin Hank Cameron, who had a program on the weekends at WUFO, Cameron's Corner, and he was doing primarily jazz. And Hank introduced me to radio. On the weekends, I would go out to the studio with him, which was on Cayuga Road at the time. And then I started getting fascinated with radio in general. And at the time, he suggested that I take a public speaking class that was being offered at the downtown Y. And it was run by a gentleman who was the sales manager for WBEN radio at the time. So it was I think, a 8-week course that we went through how to speak in public, voice inflection, reading scripts, writing scripts, things of that nature. And then I began studying for the FCC exam because at the time it was required by all radio announcers that we had to take meter readings, we had to log those meter readings, and we were basically responsible for the operation of the radio station. So we all had to have our FCC license in order to be on the air. So after going through that and getting that preparation, I started working part-time at WUFO, and I continued to be at the studio in the weekends with my cousin Hank. And Hank was, at the time, he would go to the various jazz clubs, either the Bon Ton, the Royal Arms, or the Pine Grill, and we would sit down with the artist that was appearing that week at any one of those venues. And if they were available for a Sunday afternoon interview and session, then Hank and I would either pick them up and bring them to the station, or they would make it out to the station themselves. And Hank would interview the artists, and I was engineering the program for Hank. So it introduced me to a lot of the musicians that came through town. I got to know people from the Three Sounds, Thelonious Monk, Stanley Turrentine, John Coltrane, Les McCann, many other artists that always were appearing locally here in Buffalo. And then the opportunity arose, and I was asked if I would take the morning drive slot. And I started the morning drive slot in, I believe it was January of 1966. And I did the morning drive. I'd have to get to the station early, turn the transmitters on, and get everything up and running, and then sign on at the appropriate time, being that it's a daytime radio station. There are different times where you have to sign on and different times where you have to sign off and shut everything down. So I did that for the first year through 66, and in 67 I was offered to join WBLK, and I left WUFO and went with WBLK as the evening drive disc jockey, and I worked 3 to 7 shift on the air, and then I engineered for George Lorenz, the Hound Dog, and his show ran from 7 to 10 p.m. So, but the first hour, as I stated, was dedication line was open, and we ran a 7-second delay, tape delay. George was in one studio, I was in the other studio engineering for him, and once I got everything set up, signaled him, we'd start the program, And my job basically was to make sure that the no vulgar language got through and went out over the air. And after 7 o'clock, I just continued to be there just in case anything happened while the Hound Dog was on the air. And I stayed with the BLK for that year, and then I rejoined WUFO in 1968, and I was working the evening drive slot at the time. Uh, and I worked that until August of 68, and the offer came for me to join the staff at WVOL in Nashville. And I left Buffalo in August of 68, joined the staff there, and I worked with VOL for until December of 68. Uh, I returned home for the holiday season and went back to Nashville to take the position of East Coast Regional Promotion Director for Shelby Singleton Productions. Shelby had multiple labels in his house, and Shelby was a producer and for different recording artists. He, at the time when he left to set up Shelby Singleton, he had worked for many years with Mercury Records. And some of the hits that Shelby produced were with Brooke Benton, and the duets with Brooke Benton and Dinah Washington. And he recorded quite a few other artists. I believe Billy Eckstein was one. And if you look up Shelby Singleton and do a Google search on Shelby, you will see a tremendous background with various recording artists. And that began my tenure into the recording industry as promotion and marketing executive. Some of the history of WUFO. I came after some of the more famous disc jockeys. Speaking of Eddie O.J., Frankie Crocker, let's see, Jerry Bledsoe, known as Jerry B here in Buffalo. All of those guys went on to WWRL in New York City. Eddie, I think, was the first to leave and go, then was followed by Frankie, and then followed by Jerry. Also, Sonny Jim Kelsey. He joined the company that owned WWRL, and Sonny Jim ended up at WOL, which was based in Washington, D.C. And the sales manager for WUFO was a gentleman by the name of Ben Bolden. And Ben took over the sales manager's position at WOL in D.C. So I got a chance to reunite with Jerry, Frankie, and Eddie O.J. As a promotion executive with Shelby Singleton, and also with Chess Records based out of Chicago, which both companies based me in Washington, D.C. I was in D.C. for about 8.5 years. And after Chess Records, I joined Polydor Records. Polydor first came to this country as a subsidiary of Deutsche Grammophon. Deutsche Grammophon was known throughout Europe for their library of classical music, which is now selling in the United States and has been for years. But one of the first artists that Polydor signed was James Brown. James had left King Records, where most of his early hits were recorded, based in Nashville. And King Records also had a subsidiary called Soundstage 7. Uh, Many of the people who are from the South will probably remember Randy's Records and Ernie's Records. Actually, they were radio shows or radio programs that was being broadcast over uh, WLS. No, not WLS. It's another radio station. Yeah. There's another radio station I can't remember that radio station. So I'm trying to remember the radio station. But John R. and Ernie and there was one other fella. They were basically disc jockeys that recorded their own stuff through Soundstage 7. And Soundstage 7 had a few hits. And one of the artists they had was Joe Simon. Yeah, Joe Simon had quite a few hits. But when Polydor came into existence, James went with Polydor and Joe went with Spring Records. And that's where he had a few hits. So I got a chance to meet James personally. I met James actually here in Buffalo when I was working for WUFO. James at the time had a tremendous band. James's band would blow the roof off of most places. He was doing a show at Memorial Auditorium, and Jerry and myself were backstage talking with James. Danny, James's MC and basically all around man. And Danny was a part of the Famous Flames, the background singers. And I witnessed something that I had never seen before with any live band performance. James had 4 drummers. 3 were on stage at the same time. And 1 drummer was always backstage. He was the one that was taking a break. And when it came time for the next drummer to leave, the drummer that was backstage would come on, replace one of the drummers. That drummer would go backstage and get his rest. You know, James was known for wearing out drummers at the time. His band was prolific. I have to give him credit. He was unbelievable. But when I was at WUFO, I got a chance to meet quite a few artists. Got a chance to meet Hank Ballard from Hank Ballard and the Midnighters. Got a chance to meet Otis Redding. Quite a few, Bobby Bland, B.B. King, Muddy Waters. So it introduced me to a lot of well-known, nationally known, and internationally known musicians. So it was a wonderful time. Jerry was phenomenal. Jerry was a very laid-back kind of guy, but Jerry had what I didn't have, and in the business is known as pipes. Jerry had that voice. You know, he had that very deep voice, and that's one of the characteristics of Jerry. And he was a great guy to work with. I also worked with Don Mullins.
Yes.
Don was news director at the time and also gospel director. Don had his own gospel show that he would do, and Don would do the news.
I understand he's another guy that had pipes.
Don did. And Don also, at the time he was working at WUFO, he was also working for General Motors. I believe it was at the Tonawanda plant. I'm almost sure it was the Tonawanda plant. So he was doing quite well. Um, yeah, and then we had part-timers, Al Brisbane, who came on. Al was a great guy. He was another laid-back kind of guy, and had a good ear for music, great ear for music. Uh, Al and I used to have conversations, long conversations about music, and it was not only soul music, but jazz. And Al was a fantastic conga drummer. Yeah, he was. He and his brother Kurt, uh, years ago at the corner of Ferry and Humboldt, Kurt had a barber shop, and Al used to work there in the barber shop. And whenever there were jam sessions around town, you would always find um, Al and Kurt, and they were there with their conga drums, and they would supply the rhythm for a lot of the local artists. Um, there was also, it used to be a place in Buffalo years ago, and it was at the corner of Michigan and East North. It was called Club Cayo, and they were known for their Tuesday night jam sessions. Most jam sessions occurred on Sunday afternoon in Buffalo at the time, or they occurred on Monday evenings. But Club Cayo had theirs on Tuesday evening. And I happened to be in the club one evening, and everybody just basically stopped talking. Buffalo's most well-known and respected saxophone player walked in. Speaking of Grover Washington Jr. And I knew Grover from high school. Grover and I met in high school. And he walked in, and in the middle of a song, unpacked his saxophone, walked up on stage, and just joined in, and the whole place went crazy. Grover was phenomenal. He was a phenomenal musician. I'd been to Grover's house many times when we were in high school, and Grover was one of the most well-versed musicians that I had ever known. Grover played organ, which a lot of people don't realize. He played piano as well as the organ, but Grover played tenor, baritone, alto, soprano, flute, and oboe. And a lot of people don't really realize that because all they ever hear Grover with is either soprano or alto saxophone, and sometimes tenor. But Grover was unbelievable. He was an accomplished musician in high school. And after high school, Grover and I both went in the service at around the same time. And I got out about 3 months before Grover did. I got out in August of '64, and I think Grover got out in November of '64. And that's when he came into the Cayo and played. So, yeah, it's some of the other people that, let's see.
Gary Bird.
Gary Bird, yes, phenomenal young man. Gary was in high school, and he was hanging out at the radio station with Jerry and myself. And Gary had won for 2 years, I believe, 2 years in a row. Gary won the Richmond speaking contest. I believe that's still going on in the Buffalo Public Schools. 2 years in a row, he won the speaking contest, and he had a desire to get into radio. So Jerry went to the school, because Gary was at East High School at the time, and he sat down with the principal and the assistant principal and arranged for Gary's time at the radio station to be counted towards his curriculum, and so that he would be able to graduate on time and not miss any needed classes for graduation. One of the other aspects of Gary was very prolific with the spoken word. That's what they call it now. Gary was one of the first spoken word records that Gary did was produced by a gentleman by the name of Buddy Scott in New York City. And that was the time when Sugar Hill Gang had first started. Grandmaster Flash and those guys with Sylvia and Joe Robinson. Buddy produced the first recordings on Gary, and they sold pretty well. And from that point on, Gary incorporated that into his radio shows, his radio programs. The last I heard, I know Gary was at BLS in New York for quite a while, and the last I understand, Gary is at WLIB in New York, and I believe he's still there. You know, I knew Chucky T. Chucky.
Stories about Chucky T.
Yes, Chucky T. And I mean this in a good way. Chucky T missed his calling, because Chucky should have been a comedian. He would have been a great stand-up comedian. He was. I would have put him up there with Eddie Murphy and people like that. Chucky was a funny guy. He was good. He was a good DJ, but like I said, he would have been a great stand-up comedian. I think he would have made it real big as a comedian. Yeah. Yeah, the building is still standing. At the time I was there, it's just a 2-story building, and it's if you go out Main Street to Cayuga Road, you make the right turn. There's a building on the corner, and it would be the first building on your right. So that building is still there. I believe an insurance company occupies the first floor of that building. I'm not sure what's on the second floor. But WUFO's offices and studios were on the second floor. As you go up the stairs, you would come in to the administrative offices. There would be the receptionist, the sales people's offices, the general manager's office. And then there was a hallway which would lead you to a second studio. The on-the-air studio was in the back, along with the production studio. And then there was, in the on-the-air studio, was the racks that held the controls and meters for the transmitter. It was a compact, nice setup. One of the advantages that I found was that if anything happened in the on-the-air studio, with the patch panel that was right behind you in the studio, you could patch in the production studio and broadcast live right from the production studio. So if an equipment failure happened in the on-air studio, you could go right to the production studio and continue on. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that the Dynamic Broadcasting, which owned WUFO at the time I was working for them, they owned WAMO in Pittsburgh. They owned here WUFO in Buffalo, and they also owned WILD in Boston. Now, WUFO was the only daytime radio station. WILD and WAMO, they had 24-hour capability. ILD had the 24-hour capability built right in as an AM station. But WAMO in Pittsburgh was a daytimer with an FM station, so that the daytime station would be your AM station, simulcast through the FM station, and the FM station would go until the next morning when the AM station came back on. WUFO, a lot of people had always spoke of a desire for WUFO to go 24 hours. And that is a very remote possibility. The reason being is that there is a radio station in Hartford, Connecticut, that's on the same frequency, 1080. And in order for WUFO to go 24 hours, that station in Hartford would have to reduce power so that there's no interference with the stations being at the same frequency. And that's the only, WUFO would have to either buy and take over ownership of an FM station so that they could go 24 hours, or that station in Hartford would have to reduce its power at night. And if, well, you know about radio, sales are generated not only because of the popularity of your programming, but because of the distance of coverage. And if you have that coverage, then you don't want to lose that by reducing power and reducing your coverage, which will cut into your revenue. George was, let me put it to you this way. The station was struggling from day one, okay? One of the requirements of the announcers was that if you were on the staff, the announcing staff at BLK, you were also required to sell your airtime. And that's the way it used to be years and years and years ago.
WUFO the same way?
Back in the beginning, yes. Now, WUFO went on the air, I believe, in 60, I think it was.
61.
61, okay. They had a very limited staff. And they did have salespeople, but some of the guys had to get out there in the public and assist the sales staff in order to bring in the revenue, okay? When, I'm not sure who was the general manager at the time, but when I was on board with WUFO, Jim Corrin was the general manager. But getting back to George, George was very, very protective of the radio station. I didn't find out until after I had started working there that one of the investors was the DeFilio family. Now, a lot of people are not familiar with Michael DeFilia. Michael DeFilia went through grammar school with me and high school at 74. He became famous as Michael Bennett, a chorus line, and a few other Broadway productions. His family, his mother and father, were some of the original backers of BLK. And I happened to find that out by knowing them when they came into the studios at night in the Rand building where we were located then. They were meeting with George back in George's office, okay? So that's how I found that out. But George was a hustler, okay? A lot of the shows that went on at Memorial Auditorium. Now, a lot of people don't remember, a lot of your older audience members will remember, there used to be shows at the upstairs Odd, which was in Memorial Auditorium. There was a back entrance. You go up the stairs, and there was this huge room, and with a full stage. And a lot of the shows that were booked in there on Sunday night, George brought those artists in, okay? B.B. King came through there one night with a 33-piece orchestra. B.B. King. Hank Ballard and the Midnighters came through. Otis Redding came through. They had many multi-artist reviews that came through, okay? And George booked all of those shows. And the room was massive. And regardless of how many people were there, how loud the band was, it never filtered over into Memorial Auditorium whatsoever. And one of the things that upset me when they did the history of Memorial Auditorium before they tore it down, they didn't mention not once anything about the upstairs Odd. Now, the only one that I know of that may have some of those posters from those shows, because George always had to have posters printed up, and those posters were on display all around the community, might be his son Frank. His son Frank, who I wouldn't know how to get in touch with right now, but Frank might have those things. George also had it was like a tip sheet for music, for pop music and soul music. And it was called Mickey Turntable. And the young lady that wrote and produced the show with George's approval, she passed away a few years ago, but she was very nice and kept it going after George's death. And she suddenly passed away about 4 or 5 years after George passed away. So, but Frank, and there was one other son, I can't remember his name, but they might be able to find or be able to produce some of the old posters and things and the memorabilia from some of those shows that George did. Yeah. But George was a straight shooter. I have to give him that much. Yeah, he was a straight shooter. He told you what it was like and what was done. George, through his efforts, I was the first black disc jockey to do a live remote broadcast from W.T. Grant's, which used to be down on Main Street near, I believe it was Court Street. Yeah, Main near Court. I did a show there. And George also did, he always had, at Christmas time, he had a Christmas house. And he would broadcast it from one of the storefronts on Jefferson in the old Apollo building. And I used to we all did our shows from there, did a live remote broadcast from the storefront. And we had Black Santas, and kids would come in. They had tons of stuff, gifts that we gave away to the kids in the community. So I have to give him credit for that, you know. I've been in the building, and I met, at the time, I had a meeting with I believe the general manager's name was Joe Foreman.
Okay.
I had a meeting with him because when I returned to Buffalo in August of '76, Frank found out that I was back, and Joe Foreman found out that I was back in town, and they both offered me jobs. But at the time, I was not ready to get back in radio. I had been off the air since '68. This was '76. And format radio had taken over. One of the problems that came about when I was at WUFO, and there was a meeting in Pittsburgh with the owners of Dynamic Broadcasting, who owned all 3 stations at the time. And it was decided then that the national PD, program director, was going to take over the music for all 3 radio stations. And he came up with the brilliant idea, and I say that sarcastically, that if a record was number 1 in Pittsburgh, it would be number 1 in Buffalo, and it would be number 1 in Boston, which did not make any sense with any of us. And at the time at WUFO, Bill Curtis was the program director. And Bill, he was highly upset because it was not reflective of the record sales in Buffalo. Just because a record is number 1 in Pittsburgh, the top selling record in Pittsburgh, does not mean it's going to be the top selling record in Buffalo. And likewise in Boston. You know, not too often do you have records that are number 1 across the board in all markets. You know, and that's still true today. Right after that decision was made, Bill left, and he took over programming duties at WCHB and WCHD in Detroit, which was owned by Dr. Cox, a black doctor in the Detroit area. And Bill left, and I think that's when Jerry became program director. Jerry Bledsoe became program director. So, that was it. That was my association with WUFO. When I returned to Buffalo, I was offered a job there, and I was also offered a job at WBLK, but radio was not in my blood anymore, and there was a lot of changes going on in radio. Format radio was taking over. You didn't have the freedom to play records we all had playlists that we had to abide by, but we were not limited to playing the records in a particular order. We played the records the way we wanted to play them, you know, and that was each individual disc jockey's choice. Nowadays, most radio stations, or many radio stations, the announcers just don't have that choice anymore. They play what comes up. To me, I long for the return of personality radio. Radio today is very very staid, put it that way. We're relying on talk more so than anything else. When we had personality radio, we had ratings that were competitive in the market. When I was at WUFO, we were competitive in Toronto and Hamilton and in St. Catharines, Ontario. It's not happening now. I'm not sure if that's because of the lack of personality or it's because of signal problems. But when I was on the air and the guys that preceded me, we were big in Toronto, Hamilton, and St. Catharines. And we could go up there or, well, put it this way, everybody, a lot of Canadians on the weekends would be here in Buffalo. If they're here on the weekends now, they're at the shopping malls. They're not here because of the radio station. Okay, WUFO has lost that aspect of it. There has been a shift in the music. Some of the music that's being played, not particularly WUFO, but some other radio stations, I just have an aversion to. Lyrics are not the same as they used to be. You could understand the lyrics when I was on the air. Nowadays, you can barely understand what the artists are saying. The second thing is that most of the artists, especially the female artists, they all sound the same. If you listen to them carefully, they're not really singers, put it this way. Singers sing from the diaphragm. They don't sing from the throat and the nose, which is something that is taught in voice school when you learn how to sing. I grew up in a different era, and singers had to be able to carry tunes, and had to know the lyrics, and they had to be able to project. Nowadays, electronics is projecting everything. The other thing that I find with a lot of the recordings, you don't hear real instruments anymore. You hear computer generated or synthesized sounds. You don't have drummers in the studio. You don't have trumpet players, saxophone players, guitar players, bass players. You don't have that much anymore. Everything is synthesized and computer generated. And one of the things that artists are finding now is that when they go out on the road and make personal appearances, if you've twisted enough dials and created this particular sound in the studio, it's almost impossible to duplicate in person. And that's what people are paying to see. So that's another thing. Whether we get back to that or not, I don't know. It's hard to say. I doubt it very seriously. But something's going to have to change with radio today, as the way it's being programmed. And with a lot of the stations, you have programming consultants now that are located not in a particular market. The difference was Buffalo used to be a good breakout secondary market. If a record could break out here in Buffalo, you could force stations in New York, Philadelphia, Detroit, and Chicago to start playing that record. And a lot of people would start their records, companies would start their records here, in secondary markets. Buffalo was like that. Charlotte was like that. Richmond was like that. Baltimore was like that. You know, these secondary markets mainly made a lot of recording artists. And nowadays, you have people who are sitting in one location in certain places around the country, and they're programming for everything. I remember the time when WKBW, WJYE, and there was another radio station in the city at the time. They would have never played a Motown record, would never have played anything from Atlantic, okay? But once they realized that white kids were buying Motown and Earth, Wind and Fire and Wilson Pickett and things of that nature, then they started playing it. Now you got JYE that is playing soft rock, as they call it, but you listen to the soft rock and they're slipping in all the old R&B hits from 20, 30 years ago. You know, 20, 30 years ago, they wouldn't have been caught dead playing it. One of the most astounding things that happened to me when I was on the road for Chess Records, I was in New Orleans because there was a station in New Orleans, a pop radio station, that refused to play the Dells' Stay in My Corner, which was our big record at the time. And I went up to the station to sit down and talk with the program director and the music director, and to find out what their reasons were for not playing a #1 record in the market. And the program director told me this, that they were very careful about the quality of their sound on the air, and that they put the record, the Dells' Stay in My Corner, they put it on an oscilloscope. And on this oscilloscope, it showed up distorted, and therefore they couldn't play the record. That was the most fantastic excuse for not playing a hit record I've ever heard in my life.
Okay.